All right, guys, so here we are in our prac area on our work site. And so the first thing we're going to do before we get stuck into any work is have a look at our SWMS, our Safe Work Method Statement. So this is how we're going to make sure that everything we're doing throughout the job is nice and safe. And that if there are any hazards, we've got appropriate controls in place to make sure we stay nice and safe the whole way through. I don't want to lose any fingers. I don't know about you.
I've got all my digits still in place. They don't grow back.
Good way, good way. All right. So just having a look at the SWMS here. First thing we're going to do is set out our walls. So we've got our wall plates down the front here.
Yep.
Some of the hazards it says is trips and falls and muscle injury. So we need to check the area for hazards and use a team lift on long lengths. So once we build the wall, we can work together to stand those up.
We've got a couple of lintels and things we're going to cut through, don't we, Pete?
Yep.
So I think that'll be a big thing. We'll need to lift it together. And I guess just engaging properly and lifting. Yeah?
Beautiful. Trips and falls, checking the area for hazards. As you can see, we've got these blocks on the ground here. So, they're there to just hold our flooring together. So we just need to be mindful of those that we don't trip over. The next step is cutting our plates to length. So these ones are already cut, but we just need to make sure that we just avoid any cuts and abrasions. Make sure the material is well supported. We cut them on the drop saw, so we stayed nice and safe there. And obviously the whole time, made sure we were wearing our PPE.
Just talking about cuts and abrasions, Pete, I found that the proper training that goes into how to use saws has been the biggest contributing factor to reduce any of those OH&S issues that might come up from somebody cutting themselves or something like that. Actually understanding through proper training how to use those tools.
All right, we're going to assemble the frames. So it's going to be the same thing, muscle injury and trips and falls. So we're going to work together on that and just be mindful of what's around us. Standing the frames up, we're going to be nice and strong and do that together. When we're working up high, so when we're connecting our walls together up the top, we're just going to make sure we're using an appropriate ladder there. So we've got plenty of them on hand. So we'll use that shortly.
And that the ladder's on a stable ground and actually set up on a flat area. They are probably the most important things. Ladders lead to 80% of accidents that happen onto a building site. So setting them up properly is probably one of our key instruments to making sure that they're safe when we're putting our frames up.
The SWMS is looking good. Now, what's next up on the plan? We'll make sure we have a good look.
So while we're looking at this, Pete, what we're doing is we're actually just going to be looking at this section here, which is just finishing off these last two walls. We've got our third one, which has already been pre-built. But we've got to be cutting a lintel in here. So we'll need to do the set out, make sure our spacing's right, and ensure that the timber that we've used is the correct timber. The timber at the back here, you can see we've used for treated pine, and that's 90 by 45.
Yep.
Whereas this front section's 35. So making sure that when we're looking over our engineering and that we're looking at our plans, that we stick with the Australian standard, 1684, and we're making sure that all of our spacings and the size of all of our timber is the correct timber that we need. So Pete, we've looked at the frame, and what we're going to do is start laying out this wall. We've got a 90 mil wall junction over there. So we can't just measure this entire plate to lay it out. We actually have to take into consideration the position of all the other frames and how they're coming together.
Beautiful.
So can I get you just to hold that on my 90 mil mark for my junction? I'm going to measure all the way through, and here I've got 3190.
So that's the total length of the wall.
So that's the total length of the wall. So we're going to be putting ours in the middle of the wall, aren't we?
Yeah, so there's an opening in the middle of the wall, and then I've just had a look at a window schedule here. So the window is 2 meters wide.
Okay, so we've got 1595 is the center of that wall. So I've just measured 1595, which is my halfway point. Wherever I mark, Pete, I just put a C for the center point.
Yep. Beautiful.
Okay, so you're saying we're 2 meters?
2 meters.
So we'll need to make that 2 meters 20?
2 meters 20 to allow for 10 mil gap either side of the window.
Okay, so I'll set that on 1 meter 10, and you can mark that at your end, and I'll mark this at my end.
Awesome. So before we get too far ahead of ourselves, what we've got here is our wall plates down on the ground, sandwiched together. So that's our bottom plate on the bottom, and this is our top plate on the top. So this is going to build up to be our wall like we've got here behind us. So now we've marked out, we've found the center because we know that our opening is going to be in the center of the wall. So we found our center point, and then we've worked out either side from that. So now that we've got these marked in, we can mark out where our studs are going to be, our window studs, either side of our window.
And what would we usually mark the studs at? So our studs are the pieces of timber that stand upright. And how far apart would they usually sit, Pete?
Well, 450 centers is standard practice, but depending on the roof load and things like that, you can stretch it out to as far as 600 centers.
Okay, that's interesting. Thanks. So we just draw this along, do we?
Yeah, so we'll square that around the front so it can be seen by everyone.
Okay.
So we're just using our square here and then around the front. There we go. So we know this is our opening here. So when we mark out, or when I mark out, everyone does theirs a little bit differently. I'm going to put a W there. So I know that that's a window, and that's where my window stud's going to be. And whatever I mark out on the top, I'll mark the same out on the bottom. And this will really all tie in and make sense when we start to lay the wall out. So Jojo, I got my window stud, and then we'll put a closing stud next to it.
Sure, sounds like a great idea.
A common stud is usually marked just with an X. So we've got our window stud and then a common stud there. Now, if I have a look down the end here, we're going to have a wall junction because we're going to have this wall here, and then there's another wall coming through here on these blue lines that we've set out before. So there's another wall that's going to come in and butt into this wall there. You can see we've got this line marked across the front there. So to mark this out, we're going to want a stud on the end, because you usually have a stud on the end of your wall, and then we're going to have a junction in here, so a junction block. So I can put a J on there, and I'm upside down, so I can't remember which way a J goes. There you go. J there, and then another stud there. So that's my junction all marked out. So you'll see where this comes together, and it just gives us a little bit more. We've got our stud on the end, it's got our junction block in there, and that just allows us to connect those two walls together nice and neatly.
And it gives us also somewhere to be cladding our plaster or our internal paneling on the inside as well as the outside, doesn't it?
That's right. It gives us a stud on either side of the corner, and then it allows us to fix our lining after that. All right, the last thing I'll do on my end, like we said, our stud spacing is 450 mil. So if I put my tape on there, because that's where our last stud is, and I run my tape out here, I can see that from this point here to where that stud's going to be there, I've got about 520. So it's just a little bit over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to put one more stud somewhere in the middle here. I could put it right there at 450, but then it might get a little bit cramped up here. So I'm just going to put it in about the middle at 300 mil off that.
That's perfect, Pete. Mine's exactly the same. So I might suit you then and do the same thing. I'll mark the very ends, and then I'll come halfway through and mark it there and continue mining. So I'll just break up that area. That'll be much better for our cladding too, won't it?
Perfect.
Great.
All right, well, I think that's this wall all marked out.
So next we'll move on to the next wall, and we'll do 450 centres. And then, as you said, looking at the engineering, we need to be putting cross bracing and things on that.
Fantastic. All right, let's do it.
Let's do it. So, Pete, what I've got here is a whole wall that I've got to set out for 450 centres. Is that right?
That's right. It's just a straight stud wall, 450 centres, and there's a brace that we're going to chuck on later.
Okay, so I've got a really great little trick that I do for this.
Beautiful.
I figure out first where my wall junction's going to be, and I make my line. Then from my line, what I love to do is just grab one of these small little framing nails that we use in our gun, and I tack that into place like that.
Yep.
And then from there, all I need to do is hook the end of my tape measure over that, and I can measure my 450 centres straight away. So from there, I've got my 450, and I do a tick. You'll notice that each time I mark it, I put a tick or a cross on the waist side, so I know the side of where my stud's going to go every single time.
That's right, because we're measuring to the side of the stud, not to the center of the stud.
And if I need to double check any of my measurements, what you were talking about before, I always revert back to my 9 times table. So the first one's 900, then 1800. obviously there's in between, which is 2250, but then I double check that measurement by hitting 2700, yeah?
Yep.
So from that 2700, I'm getting pretty close to the end of this wall here. So if I just do 3150, and then we've got another area that's meant to be a wall junction, but what I might do with this one then, Pete, is cancel out this last stud, if that's okay by you.
Yep.
Because that's got a good safe distance between those two, and it's good for our cladding system on the other side.
Beautiful. Looks
Okay,
good to me.
great. So from there, I'll then make sure that all of my areas are squared around and that each position of every one of those studs is in the correct position and marked up. So then when we separate the wall and we lay it out, we know exactly where every one of those studs are going to go.
No worries, I'll give you a hand.
Awesome. Thanks, buddy.
All good, I'm all done. How
I'm
you
all
mate?
done too, Pete. So what we'll do then is we'll lay it out, we'll pull the nails out, and we'll start looking at the position of our top plate and our bottom plate. Have we figured out the exact length of our common stud yet?
I don't think we have. So we know the overall wall height by looking at the plan is 2700.
Okay. And then what do we need to take into consideration? The height of the finished floor or any of the packing of the ceiling, like a ceiling batten or a piece of plaster? Do we have to take those into consideration for this job, or have you already considered that?
We've already considered that on this job, but it's definitely something to refer to your plans about. If you have a thick flooring going on, whether it be carpentry, thick carpet, underlay, you know, that might be 50 mil extra in there. And then by the time you come down by having maybe a slightly dropped ceiling or something like that,
Yep.
it's going to start creeping up and creeping down.
Right.
So you need to take those into account. The other thing to think about is when you're figuring out your stud height, maybe you need a ribbon plate, a second double top plate. Depending on what roofing system is going on, you might need to run that in, and you might need to take that into account as well.
Okay.
All right, so are we ready to lay some walls out and get some studs going?
Sounds perfect.
Beautiful. Let's do it.